Hissa Shidqa. I'm a psychology student with student number 24080155149, and I'm from class 1E. This video is created to fulfill the final assignment for the English language course under the supervision of Mrs. Anita. Here, I will explain about one of the most well-known figures in the psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. So, who is Wilhelm Wundt? Wilhelm Maximilian Wundt was born on August 16, 1832, in the German town of Neckarau, outside of Mannheim, the son of Lutheran minister. The family moved when Wilhelm was 6 to the town of Heidenheim in central Baden. By all accounts, he was a precocious, peculiar boy, schooled mainly by his father's assistant, the vicar, Frederick Müller. The young Wilhelm was so attached to Müller that he moved in with him when the latter got a post in a neighboring village. Wundt studied at the gymnasium at Brussels in Heidelberg and entered the University of Tübingen at 19 in 1851. After 1 year, he transferred to the University of Heidelberg, where he majored in medicine. By his third year, his intense work ethic yielded his first publications. Nevertheless, doctoring was not Wundt's vocation, and he turned instead to physiology, which he studied for a semester under Johannes Müller, the father of experimental psychology, at Berlin. In 1856, at the age of 24, Wundt took his doctorate in medicine at Heidelberg and habilitated as a docent in physiology. 2 years later, the physicist, physiologist, and psychologist Hermann von Helmholtz received the call to Heidelberg as a professor of physiology, a decisive moment for Wundt's career, with Wundt working as Helmholtz's assistant from 1858 until 1865. When Helmholtz moved to Berlin in 1871, Wundt was passed over as Helmholtz's replacement. 3 years later, he took the chair in inductive philosophy at the University of Zurich. He remained at Zurich for only 1 year before receiving an appointment to a first-class chair of philosophy at Leipzig in 1875. Leipzig's philosophy department, dominated by Herbartians, provided the ideal environment for his intellectual flowering. The soil had been prepared by Fechner, Weber, and Lotz. Wundt became famous at Leipzig. It was here in 1879 that the university formally recognized his little room of equipment as a bona fide laboratory, the world first devoted to psychology. Students flocked to Wundt, and while he set the tone and directions of research, it was largely they who constructed apparatus, performed experiments, and published results. Enrollment in his courses doubled about every 15 years, reaching a peak of 620 students in the summer of 1912. Wundt ended up sponsoring 186 PhD dissertations, about a third of which apparently involved purely philosophical topics. Though Wundt participated actively in labor politics in his early years at Heidelberg, even being elected to the Baden parliament, he steadily drifted rightwards, eventually being persuaded by his violently anti-Semitic son, Max, a historian of philosophy, to join ultranationalist Deutsche Philosophische Gesellschaft after 1917. It is hard to ignore Wundt's unattractive applications of his late social and cultural psychology to the tendentious critique of Germany's enemies. Nevertheless, His drive and unflagging intellectual advocacy will arouse admiration in some. Even at age 80, he remained involved in academic controversy. But let us consider the man through his work. Wundt identifies physiological with experimental psychology. Thus, for Wundt, experimental psychology is the unmediated study of consciousness, aided by the experimental protocols of the natural sciences. Yet, this definition involves two constable assumptions. First, that consciousness is susceptible to experiments. Second, that psychology, even if conceived as experiment, has for its objects consciousness or the mental. Wundt defines consciousness as inner experience. It is only the immediately real phenomena constituting the experience, and nothing behind or beyond it. That is the object of psychological as opposed to physiological or psychophysical investigations. In Wundt's declarations that individual psychology must become a science via the experimental manipulations of inner phenomena, we see a pragmatic attitude, perhaps peculiar to the working scientist. The future science as doctrine takes shape in and through the present practice of experimentations. It assigns trials, and errors. Nevertheless, Wundt repeatedly addresses the objections raised against the very possibility of psychological, as opposed to physiological or psychophysical experimentations. Wundt's innovations is the attempt to project the experimental rigor of physiology into the domain of inner experience by supplementing these experiments with purely psychological set of procedures. These procedures constitute Wundt's well-known yet misunderstood method called introspections, or better, self-observations. Now, Wundt is well aware of the common criticism that self-observation seems inescapably to involve the paradoxical identity of the observing subject and observed object. Indeed, he takes pains to distinguish his notions of self-observations from that of most advocates of the so-called empirical psychology, which he calls a fount of self-delusions. According to Wundt, psychological experiments, thus conceived, accomplish in the realm of consciousness precisely what natural scientific experiments do in nature. They do not leave consciousness to itself, but force it to answer the experimenter's questions by placing it under regulated conditions. Wundt's view of logic is unusual, but fully in line with his rigorously anti-metaphysical monistic perspectivism. That is, there are no logical truth realm, but merely a single process called thinking. It is an immediately given fact of thinking that there are logical laws that stand over against all our other thoughts and representations as norms. Their psychological immediacy does not. Wundt thinks compromise their normativity, since what is given in consciousness precisely is their normative character, hence this character is taken for granted. The science of logic develops its systems of correct deductions without further worry about the search of that normativity. All that remains is developing the foundations and methods of scientific knowledge. According to Wundt, the three features of logical thinking that set it apart from all other types of representational connections are its spontaneity, evidence, and universal validity. Let us briefly describe these. Wundt's notions of the spontaneity of logical thinking is perhaps the most psychologistic sound of the three, because, as we described before, thinking is experienced immediately as an inner activity. We must regard it as an act of will, and accordingly regard the logical laws of thought as laws of the will. Wundt's conceptions of psychology was always controversial. At least in Germany, the struggle over the status of philosophical meaning of consciousness resulted, on the one hand, in the exclusion of Wundtian empirism from philosophy departments, striving to maintain their speculative purity, and, on the other, the institutional establishment of experimental psychology as an independent discipline. This was not the outcome Wundt had desired. He had wished to reform philosophy, not as synthetic science, but with a direct, indispensable juridical relation vis-a-vis both the natural and human sciences. He never saw his psychological scientism as a threat to philosophy. On the contrary, he considered his psychology to be a part of philosophy, one necessary for philosophy to take its proper place in the totality of the sciences. Indeed, philosophy could only assume that positions through the mediating physicians of psychology. Yet, academic philosophers denied the possibility of any legislative or executive functions in the sciences, rejected the juridical ones as well, bitterly resisting contaminations of their pure pursuit by the empirism of the new psychology. In Germany, resistance was especially stiff among neo-Kantians and later the phenomenologists. In the end, the quarreling parties ineluctably assumed positions similar to their opponents, though of course in a purified way. Let us return to James' main remark about Wundt. He has no naive vital, no central idea, and so this would be Napoleon Planarian can never be killed all at once. Setting aside Wundt's need to be killed all at once or in bits, a fair and attentive reader will respectfully reject such scintillating criticism. For although Wundt has many ideas, like the theory of actuality, the principle of psychophysical parallelism, voluntarism, and creative resultants, yet they all do have a single unifying note, namely what I have here called monistic perspectivism. If Wundt has a big idea, it is that being a single fluff of becoming with many sides and many ways of being described. Consequently, we, as part of this being, we have many ways of describing and explaining it. Few have as unblinkingly accepted the consequences of their starting points, or more, doggedly pursued them to their various ends as Wundt's. Wilhelm Wundt sadly departed on August 31, 1920, at the age of 88, in Grossbotten, Germany, merely 15 days following his birthday. Well, maybe that's all from me. Thank you for all your attentions. I apologize for any disrespects. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.